no matter how powerful those GPUs get, and if we have some breakthrough in energy and we're able to break or bend that curve, that what seems unsustainable for the power demands to power these GPU clusters, if we're able to flatten that curve and we're able to figure out how to do more interesting things with GPUs, there are still classes of problems that they just aren't well suited to solve. And I think about those in the following way. The most powerful GPU cluster, at the end of the day, is boiling all problems down to zeros and ones, right? And it's unbelievable what you can do with that binary logic when done billions of times. And they're going to keep finding out great new use cases to point that 0 and 1 logic at. But that is not actually how nature works, right? Nature behaves by the laws of quantum mechanics. And so the problems that are under that bucket, whether that is, and these are the common ones always talked about, molecular modeling, so therefore material science or drug discovery, and then optimization type problems or other things of that nature. I do think quantum computers are going to get quantum advantage on those types of problems relatively quickly because their underlying architecture is just suited to solve those problems, as opposed to trying to force fit that 0 and 1 logic into these types of problems that it's just a heuristic, right? The world doesn't actually work in zeros and ones. It works based on quantum mechanics. And so we can force fit that heuristic into quantum mechanics to a certain extent, but it will be much more efficient to do it underlying quantum architecture because that is how the world actually works.
Welcome to another episode of the Quantum Economy podcast. Today I'm joined by Matthew Kinsella, the CEO of Inflection. Matt has a fascinating background from venture capital and deep tech investments, and he was the seed investor in Inflection back in 2018 before joining the company as their CEO in 2024, taking the company from a spin-out to a global player, shaping the future of quantum technologies in the field of defense, logistics, finance, and beyond. Now at the helm of Inflection, he's going public with the company. And he's building the infrastructure of a quantum future far beyond computing alone. He has big hopes for humanity and his values in place. Joining me from Boulder, Colorado, the US capital of quantum, here is the Quantum Economy podcast with Matt Kinsella. So Matt, first of all, thank you for coming on. Is it the way to go with quantum now to take a business-minded person, put him on the top of the CEO, go public, and to commercialize? Are we there now?
Well, thank you for having me, Anders, and I guess so, right? Because that has been my trajectory to get into the company. I came from the investment world, was the first investor in Inflection back in early 2018. Have been on the board ever since, helping to build the company, and then stepped in full time to work at the business full-time back in the beginning of last year, and made the decision earlier this year that this was the right path for us to go for a lot of different reasons.
But I mean, you have that background as a deep tech investor, and yeah. It's not very typical to then take on an operational role. In particular, if you look at the interests of a broader deep tech portfolio, what made you go into to that role now, and to see that Inflection is the right horse to bet on, so to speak?
You are very right that this is not that normal. And actually, if I flush out the whole situation for you, you'll see that there were many versions of the world where this would not have been the path of least resistance. So if we go back to 2017, well, even go back further, I was at my firm Maverick for 18 years. So I started there right out of college. Maverick is both a public equity investment fund and then also a venture capital fund. I started my career on the public equity side of the business, so investing in the stock market, focus on technology. And then in 2014, we decided as a firm to launch an early stage venture fund. And this context is important just to answer your question, actually. And so Lee Ainsley, the founder of the fund, asked me to move out to San Francisco from New York to get that early stage venture fund off the ground alongside a partner. And for the next 10 years or so, I was one of those partners running that early stage venture fund. In 2017, I got super curious about quantum, started going down the quantum rabbit hole, which is, as you know, a windy, deep rabbit hole, and got totally hooked, and met a lot of the different companies that were around at the time. And the conclusion that I walked away with was the risk-reward setup from an investment perspective was actually probably the best to start something from scratch. And the reason for that was the companies I met were all relatively nascent. They were all had potentially good upside potential, but that upside was relatively binary in nature. It was, do you get a quantum computer or not? And it was unclear at the time which modality would even be successful, let alone which company. And so there was a lot of risk in making an early stage investment, such that it almost felt like the same amount of risk to build something from scratch with much more upside. So then I went from meeting companies to professors, and ultimately led me to a gentleman named Dana Anderson, who is the founder of Inflection. And Dana has been a professor at CU Boulder for 40 years. And Dana's really the first mover and pioneer in this quantum modality called neutral atoms. And I got totally enamored with neutral atoms when I met Dana, largely because they're very flexible. And so there wasn't that binary nature that a lot of the other companies that I'd met with neutral atoms. You can actually do a lot of different interesting things with them. And I'm kind of going on a tangent. I promise I'll tie it back to why did I come here? And so with that initial investment lens and the idea that, wow, we can build a quantum company that isn't this binary bet, but actually you can point this neutral atom engine at a number of different interesting end markets, build a commercial entity, and then explore whether neutral atoms might be an interesting candidate for that crown jewel of a gate-based fault-tolerant quantum computer that can do things that classical computers can't do. At the time, neutral atoms hadn't really been explored for that. In a little bit in the research lab, our chief scientist, Mark Safman, chief scientist for quantum, had done some work in his lab at the University of Wisconsin. But neutral atoms were kind of the new kids on the block from a computing perspective. So I seeded Dana in early 2018, joined the board, and have been helping build the company from my seat on the board ever since, and then got the really unique opportunity at the beginning of last year to join full-time. And so I had all that history with the company. I loved the company. And as a VC, and if there are any VCs are listening, they'll resonate with this. You always have one or two companies inside your portfolio that you just gravitate to and you spend way more time with than other companies. And Inflection was always that company for me. And actually, sometimes my partners would accuse me of, quote, going native because I was so in love with the company, right? And so I when this opportunity came along, I'd had opportunities to go join our companies before at Maverick and never really took them seriously. On top of that, my wife is a native San Franciscan. We had a 2-month-old and a 4-year-old at the time. My wife's parents had moved to Marin County. We were going to move to Marin County. I'd been at Maverick for 18 years. It was a wonderful job. So there was a lot of reasons why this was not the path of least resistance to take this role. So why did I take it? I took it because it's the most exciting company I've ever seen. I mean, it's the only company I've been a part of that has the possibility to be the next NVIDIA. And obviously we'd have to execute the heck out of it to get there, but it had that kernel. It has all the, the basic ingredients. And so the chance to be part of something special like that early was really exciting to me. And so what should have been a hard decision became a pretty easy one. Once, I got past the first conversation with my wife, which was heck no. Then the next conversation was maybe we'll think about it. Then finally we got there. And so that's really why I took it, because I love this company. I think it's going to be really important to get this technology out in the world. And I think it's really important for humanity to really bring quantum out to life. And so I felt like it was something I had to do.
That's amazing. There's so many things, so many layers to play with there. So there's the financial aspect. There's the path towards a brighter path for humanity, and then there's what interests me. I resonate with that relationship to a portfolio company. So I have an investment in a 3D DNA sequencing company. I'm looking into the whole essence of optimizing enzymes and to play with, a quote unquote moving from ChatGPT to ChatDNA moment. Very fascinating. But I've also looked into many quantum computing companies, and when I look at an investor, because there are physicists that have a very strong tie to their approach how to build an error-corrected quantum computer or even a round-temperature quantum computer. What was it like the technical hunch or the I would say like the drive you had towards Inflection, or was it a people's business? What made you put your bet on Inflection?
So when I met Dana was a professor at CU, but he'd been running Inflection for several years at that time. and it was, effectively an extension of his lab at CU Boulder. Dana was part of several Nobel Prize winning teams going back over the last 25 years or so. And all of those teams worked on what effectively culminated in neutral atom technology. Dana is an applied physicist, not a theoretical physicist. So generally speaking, the theoretical physicists are the ones who win the Nobel Prizes, and the applied physicists build the stuff, right? So Dana had actually been building these core foundational components. In fact, I can show you one. I've got one on my desk. Let me just open this. He'd been building these really for the last 2 decades or so, and selling them to other academic institutions so they could do neutral atom experiments. And so, what I really found intriguing about Dana was he was a quantum physicist, but he actually had like commercial drive. Like he was in it to try to build and grow this technology as opposed to just doing it for academia. So immediately I was drawn to Dana because of that underlying commercialization mindset, which isn't that prevalent in academia, broadly speaking. So from the people's aspect of it, I really kind of, again, I'll use that word, enamored. I was enamored with Dana for a number of reasons. So he was, the horse or the person that I wanted to back in this race. The other element of it was the neutral atom modality. And so as I was going down the early stages of my trip down the rabbit hole, I never even heard of neutral atoms. It wasn't really in the conversation. And that was largely because back then, and in some ways today, when you say quantum, people assume the only kind of companies are computing companies, and neutral atoms hadn't really been pointed at compute at that point. It had been in academia, but not commercially. And so when I learned about it, I was fascinated by the possibilities. And I'm not a physicist, so I wasn't going to be able to tell you, the actual underlying elements as to why this modality was better. But the flexibility is what drew me to it, and the idea that we can actually create a multi-shot on goal approach to building a business, and then explore whether this modality might be interesting for computing. So it wasn't necessarily like I looked at trapped ions, I looked at superconducting, I looked at photonics, I looked at neutral atoms and said neutral atoms is definitively superior to these other modalities. It was more that there was nothing that was telling me that it wasn't for computing, and I got to have these de-risked investment opportunities to build these other products with this same underlying modality. So to me, it was partially Dana, but partially the flexibility, and because of the flexibility, the possibilities in multiple ways to win that I really liked about it, and it didn't have that binary nature. And if you fast forward to today, it's been really rewarding to see that seed thesis play out. We've built several really robust commercial products in the quantum sensing umbrella that we've been monetizing along the way. And then the big surprise has been neutral atoms have gone from this dark horse quantum computing modality to really leading the way on most of the metrics that matter, and on our journey towards gate-based fault-tolerant quantum computers that can do things that classical computers can't do.
Yeah, because I see the quantum communication, the quantum sensing path of it, and then you see the challenges on compute. So I was very curious about, back then, backing it as an investor. You see a promising seed bet, I get that, but taking the step in the midst of what was back then when you took the job, it was kind of sort of reaching that investment hype that we have seen over the past 12 to 16 months, and you've seen big players with Microsoft and leading the way with a lot of I would say like more of a hype communication marketing theme, right? So it was very interesting to just get your background, why you decided to go with Dana and to go with Inflection. So thank you for doing that. And even,
absolutely.
And going to Boulder, Colorado, being on in the Bay Area, it's like I just took my dad to the U.S. a couple of months ago, and I spent a year in Nebraska. And my dad and myself, we took a car and drove all the way up to Colorado through Nebraska, the Dumb and Dumber route, because
thought the Rockies would be a little bit rockier than this, right?
Right. No, because I wanted to go up to Boulder and figure out what that place is all about because of that quantum flare. So it's interesting. So thank you so much for sharing.
Well, Anders, I'll tell you one thing. I grew up in Illinois, and a lot of my family was lived in western Nebraska.
Oh,
and
really?
that journey across Nebraska is a brutal one.
Oh,
It's like cornfields forever, right? Yeah.
but we were when the corn was not there, so it was like earlier 2025, April-ish. So
Ooh.
it's basically flat. But I wanted to go back where I stayed. So I went there when I was 17, did a year of exchange program,
Oh,
and
no way.
I never figured out why I went there to play six-man football and live with a family in a small village. But a
Yeah.
beautiful like spirit, and I'm very interested in, societies and people and all that stuff. So we had a very, very, I would say, uh, very rich flares of U.S. from New York to Nashville to Nebraska and Boulder, Colorado, and Washington, just
You
traveling
get
over.
very,
So,
very
but,
different views of what the U.S. is like in those various
yes,
parts.
but
The
that, but
good
that's
people in Nebraska, good corn-fed Midwesterners, as we like to
and
call them.
straight drives. You could just lean back and kind of sort of feel like you slept for a couple of minutes. So.
Yeah, yeah.
No, but interesting. I mean, just also a take on the market. A lot of big recent announcement on, I would say, investments. If you also look at the publicly traded quantum companies,
Yeah,
there's never been a larger gap between the ratio of sales and valuation.
yeah,
How do
yeah.
you look at the market right now? Is it hyped? Do you think that's substantial? Are we seeing a new kind of a logic to investments because of the impact? What is your take on the market?
And just to make sure we're clear, we're talking about the market for the capital raising, or is it market for selling quantum products?
No, I would say the ratio between the current revenue. So a
Yeah,
lot of the, I mean, a lot of the revenue probably that you also have are research project and things that I put content to do smaller things before you get into that actual, scale implication of the revenue part. So I'm looking at the valuation ratio
yeah,
towards
yeah,
to the revenue. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, understood. I think there's let me touch on just one aspect of the market as it relates to the actual, selling of the products and the commercialization of the business. Then I can talk about, the spread or the multiple on revenue towards to the market caps of some of the players. I do agree that really all quantum computing sales are still in that research bucket, right? It's some government somewhere has allocated dollars to buy a quantum computer, and then we or another quantum computing company fulfills that sale and gets the money and then builds a quantum computer. But the great thing about that is it helps you get better at building quantum computers and getting them towards that magical number where they'll start to do things that classical computers can't do. And it's great for the government entity, whether that's an academic institution or a national lab, or in some cases like the NQCC in the UK. They get to learn how to use quantum computers, train the workforce, and then importantly, that real estate's upgradable, right? You can then make those computers commercially useful over time. It's different on the sensing market. Like there are quantum sensing products that we sell. We sold $11 million of clocks to the DoD that are actually commercially advantageous, and I think you're starting to see that markets are starting to demand the level of performance that those quantum sensors can provide. And so I do think you're going to see an increasingly robust commercial market. It might still be in that national security bucket or so for some of these quantum sensing products, and I do think we'll see that grow. So I just want to make that distinction that most of the quantum computing revenue is still very much in the research phase. Some of the quantum sensing is, but increasingly quantum sensors are being sold in a commercialized way because they can do things, for instance, keep time orders of magnitude more precisely than classical standards. So there's my comments on kind of the game on the field for the actual commercial business parts of the market. As it relates to the valuations, I do think what you're seeing, and I do want to also say, I was a public market investor for many years. Trying to explain why stocks are doing what they're doing is effectively impossible. So I want to just make sure everything I say is speculative, and you just don't know because sometimes the market just does what it does, right? And the best advice I ever learned from being a public equity investor was don't ever give stock tips to your friends because there's a reasonable chance you're going to be wrong. And honestly, if in the public equity world, if you're batting above 500, meaning you're just getting things right more than you're getting them wrong a little bit, you're actually ahead of the pack. So all of those disclaimers said, here's my thesis on what's happening in the public markets. I think quantum computing has gone from something that's kind of been a rolling 5 years away to seemingly in a more definitive 5 year time period. And I think the reason why is logical qubits. Before the world got logical qubits, it was unclear as to whether quantum computers were ever going to reach that point where they would actually be more powerful in certain circumstances than classical computers. Once we actually showed that logical qubits were possible, it now is just a matter of time. So now it's gone from if to when. And I think that has been an underlying shift. Whether like the average person buying quantum stocks knows about that shift, I don't know, but I think it's kind of gotten the ball rolling. And so now it's turned into, okay, this is happening. We have logical qubits, we just need more of them. And I think most people, and I fall in this camp, agree that 100 logical qubits is where you start to see minimum viable commercial advantageous use cases for quantum computers versus classical. And now we're marching towards that 100 logical qubit threshold. We just announced that we had 12 logical qubits last week, and we're moving towards on a pretty defined engineering roadmap to get to that 100 logical qubit level. So I think there's a shift from it's going from if to when, and now if it's not if and it's when, how big is that opportunity going to be? And investors don't want to miss out the opportunity to be the next AI wave or something like that, right? And so I think you're starting to see some of those possibilities discounted into the stock prices before they normally would be, especially relative to where the revenues are at these points in times. And that's not unusual for these types of cutting edge technologies, because often the growth can be explosive in the underlying revenue and profitability metrics, which you see with something like OpenAI. Every time it looks crazy expensive, and then all of a sudden you fast forward a year and their revenue have gone up by 100x or whatever it is. And so I think people are starting to extrapolate that might be possible, and I'm not saying it's what's going to happen, but it might be possible in quantum, and therefore they want to make sure they have a play. And so I think there's all those elements happening. I think maybe there's some AI fatigue in the market, and they're looking for what's the next thing, and that possibly could be quantum. And so a lot of different things are playing out, but you are right that the valuations you're seeing in quantum are significantly higher than they've ever been historically.
So what do you think? I mean, we obviously could also have an argument that we haven't reached any limitation on CPUs and GPUs on scaling and energy efficiency, transistors that are more efficient. Do you see that the argument, the race for actual quantum computing is so strong, or is there still a big risk that we might actually have a new transistor and some efficiency with the current GPUs of NVIDIA, and we would just have infinite access to energy through some new breakthroughs in material design without actually a quantum computer? Do you see that, or do you think that there is now a very, very clear evidence that we will eventually have significant advantages, also not in the very outlier complex calculations, but also in some highly commercialized products within quantum?
It's a good question. I think everyone's been surprised to our upside as to what we've been able to push GPUs, what they can do, right? What we've been able to figure out how to do with them. And my guess is we'll keep figuring out how to do amazing things with GPUs. My sense, though, is that no matter how powerful those GPUs get, and if we have some breakthrough in energy and we're able to break or bend that curve, that what seems unsustainable for the power demands to power these GPU clusters, we're able to flatten that curve, and we're able to figure out how to do more interesting things with GPUs. There are still classes of problems that they just aren't well suited to solve. And I think about those in the following way. Even I forget what XAI's cluster down in Nashville is called, right? Maybe Optimus or whatever that's called, right? The most powerful GPU cluster, at the end of the day, is boiling all problems down to zeros and ones, right? And it's unbelievable what you can do with that binary logic when done billions of times. And so they're going to keep finding out great new use cases to point that 0 and 1 logic at. But that is not actually how nature works, right? Nature behaves by the laws of quantum mechanics. And so the problems that are under that bucket, whether that is, and these are the common ones always talked about, molecular modeling, so therefore material science or drug discovery, and then kind of derivative optimization type problems or other things of that nature. I do think quantum computers are going to get quantum advantage on those types of problems relatively quickly because the underlying architecture is just suited to solve those problems as opposed to trying to force fit that 0 and 1 logic into these types of problems that it's just a heuristic, right? The world doesn't actually work in zeros and ones. It works based on quantum mechanics. And so we can force fit that heuristic into quantum mechanics to a certain extent, but it will be much more efficient to do it via underlying quantum architecture because that is how the world actually works.
All right.
I don't know if I said that in the most elegant way, but I think you get
You
the
know,
point.
yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, this is Richard Feynman speaking out, right? If we want,
Exactly. Yeah. Just look at what Richard Feynman said. He's going to say it way better than I did. Yeah.
I know that's just the way of setting up. But but I wanted to get like your thoughts on all these parts of I mean, obviously I see you have a huge depth in your knowledge and understanding of quantum technologies, but I really wanted to have that quantum economical implication and to talk to you about that. And we have that, often quoted as the or framed as the quantum race.
Hmm.
What's your take? Because you also have that value driven approach to improve the state of humanity. Is the race today a race between nations, or do we have like a collaborative global challenge in the making to serve that, or your vision of a better humanity?
Yeah. It is a race, and there's no doubt about it. And it's very motivating to me um, because I think it's really important that humanity finishes this race. I wish it was that simple, though. I do think, unfortunately, there are going to be winners and not winners in this race. And I feel very strongly that the US and our allies, whether it's Germany or the UK or Australia, win that race. And I think there are huge national security implications and huge implications for our way of life. And I wish it could all just be humanity benefiting as a whole from this, but I just unfortunately don't think that's actually the case. And so I do think it is a race against between nation states, and kind of multiple nation states working together on one side and multiple nation states kind of working together on another. And the national security implications are wide ranging. Just the computing aspect of it obviously is going to have huge implications for the ability to perform calculations that probably will have huge implications on the battlefield. Obviously, decryption is one thing that everybody is very concerned about, but the whole sensing application is huge as well. Again, that the precision that you can bring with quantum timekeeping or quantum communications or quantum sensing is orders of magnitude better than classical standards. And let's just use GPS as an example.
Yeah.
Your GPS is a position, navigation, timing system. The timing is the most important thing that comes down from GPS. And so much of our critical infrastructure is based upon the synchronization that they get to the GPS network. It's way more of an issue in your neck of the woods, but GPS or GNSS in general is becoming increasingly denied, spoofed, and you're not able to rely on it. And if we just think about the implications on the battlefield,
Yeah.
let's just say, God forbid, something happened and we turned into a hot war over the Taiwanese Strait, the first thing to go is going to be GPS, right? You're going to have to operate in a GPS denied environment. And the side that can do that will have an enormous advantage. And I like to think that the knowledge that the other side has that capability might be a deterrent. And so to me, it's like I think we need to get quantum sensors, quantum timekeeping devices in the hands of our troops as soon as possible, because in the horrible scenario where something actually happens, it will give them a huge advantage, but hopefully more importantly it'll be a deterrent because the other side will know that they're going to be up against a force that would just be very difficult to deal with. So I do think it's a huge race, and it'd be objectively a good thing for all of humanity to bring quantum technologies out in the world, and I wish it was as easy as that, but I think there is that nation state race element of it for sure.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very important point that you have, and I wanna we wanna public this episode, in the lights of your your public listing and your SPAC, and I want to get to that in a bit. But
Yeah.
I just want to mention that as we speak, this is an ongoing in Denmark. You know, it's the drone attack in Denmark, flying over military resorts, flying over the airports. There
Yeah.
are ships that are discovered on the borderline between international waters and Danish waters. They are Russian battleships that have blocked the GPS and are not traceable, and there have drones flying over Denmark. It could be a relationship between those ships lying 200 kilometers from the border of Denmark and sending up these drones. That is not proven as we speak, but that is an exact example of how this warfare already today is a significant threat to national security unless you have the technology. So, you know, we were looking days of intraceable attacks through drones. I mean, they're just flying over and recording and, you know, shedding light. There is no, as we speak, no attack, but it just proves your point, right? How critical this is. And, you know, the whole aspect of QKDs and post-quantum cryptography and the whole aspect of sensing, I think it's just, as you say, I agree, and it's a race. But on that point, how do you then see the, um, the whole essence of innovation and ideas and creation? As you mentioned, you've done a lot of seed investing. You come also from
Yeah.
that. Are
Yeah.
we seeing then a switch with quantum that the whole startup community will not be uh, you know, will not be a thing because any idea will just be integrated because you just need the huge investments, you need the teams, you need to scale so fast that there is no room for a classical startup to grow. So it's all about scaling, and this race becomes so powerful, so big. So it's just about, you know, the huge investments, a winner takes all type of scenario. Do you see a shift then in how we operate, also on the business side and technology side?
In some ways, that question is about the underlying economic model that the countries are pursuing, I think. And if we just look at maybe China exemplifying the top-down approach, and we'll just use the U.S., but plenty of other examples, is maybe the bottoms-up approach. I think we've seen that even if it gets a slower start, the bottoms-up approach wins, and the unleashing of ingenuity and innovation and competitive destruction, and ultimately the cream rising to the top is the superior economic model to break into technologies like this. And so I will bet on the, let's call it, Western economic model and innovation model any day of the week. That said, this is expensive technology, and it is technology that, as we pointed out, especially in the compute side of things, doesn't have commercial advantage today. So therefore, it's very hard to do kind of that lean product, lean startup, quick product market fit iteration model that you use to bring other less deep tech type of startups out into the world. So I do think that there does need to be certain levels of stimulation from the top to help speed that process along until you can actually get to the point where someone like, let's just use, I don't know, what's a good example? Trying to think of a good company based in Frankfurt. Deutsche Bank, right? Deutsche Bank can say, I'm going to take $20 million, $30 million, $50 million off my balance sheet, buy a quantum computer, and know I'm going to earn a return off of it. Now there's an actual market for that, and then you can use those gross profit dollars that you earn to further fuel the innovation engine. But we aren't there yet for computing. Honestly, part of the reason why I built the company the way we did was because we needed to identify those earlier stage markets where we could have commercial advantage and actually build a real business. And that's why I was uncomfortable with the binary nature of the computing or nothing, because it was going to be a while before you had commercial advantage on the computing side of things. So I do think you do need a certain level of stimulation from the top to help fuel and keep that innovation engine going on the Western model. And so I think we are doing an okay job of that, but could do much more. And whether it's in the form of grand challenges or the form of just buying more systems And so the companies can actually earn gross profit dollars to continue to invest in the R&D and ultimately bring the winning technology out. But I think the competitive dynamics are incredibly important to have companies competing, because that's what pushes you further faster. And picking winners from the top is very dangerous. And I think that is why a lot of times that top-down, like command and control model just doesn't work as well. So that's
But yeah,
how
I
I
mean,
think about it.
you could push back and say, if you look at the recent development with Oracle, you could look at Elon and his endeavors, and if you look at the satellite communication, it's a monopoly in space.
Yeah.
There's no one's going to catch up in the next 10, 20 years. Building reusable rockets will take some time, even for the Chinese. You could look at Nvidia. I mean, Nvidia is close to, I think it's 2x of the DAX, the German DAX
That's
index. The whole,
unbelievable. Yeah.
yeah. So
That's incredible.
so you take your Deutsche Bank example. It's
Yeah.
cute, right? It's
Yeah.
cute. But if Deutsche Bank makes a lot of money, Nvidia could pay it out of their pockets like it was a small takeover. It's just the dimension, the
Yeah.
magnitude of the valuation is just getting so out of what we can grasp, and that's what I think, that even though we seem to have that startup innovation, Western, you call it, right, democratic structures, it is in a sense becoming so powerful that a handful of people could literally buy anything they want in that realm of scaling. So it's very interesting to look at our scientific innovative model, and you see the magnitude of these companies, and say, why would they innovate? They could just buy anything, right? So it's very interesting time, I think, in that sense.
It is, Anders, and I think it is. There is absolutely an element of that, and I think we need to be very careful, because if it's too consolidated, then that does break the whole system. I still just will always make the bet on this system, because if you look at those companies that occupy those spaces now, many of them didn't exist 20 years ago, right? And Nvidia was kind of a blip on the radar screen until 5 years ago. And so I do think that the winds can shift very quickly, and it's not like this has been the same company for 100 years, being in control of everything. And so I still think that they need to stay on their toes, because companies can come out of nowhere and completely usurp their position. And I think that's what actually keeps pushing the progress forward. But if we get to the point where it stagnates, and you're right, like companies can just buy anything that's starting to show promise, that's a very dangerous risk for our innovation system, for sure.
Yeah. No, I had an interesting conversation with, you probably know Worley from Stageworks, and his vision to enable 1 billion minds to do scientific breakthroughs. So we were talking a little bit about like how Nobel lecturers used to come out of academia, but now
Yeah.
due to the fact that they get much more money to go into the corporate labs, they can do the same thing and
Yeah.
work with
Yeah.
infinite resources and not the bureaucratic processes. Then the Nobel lecturers will come out of corporates. And he envisions a world where someone from, a rural town in Røros in Norway, where I came from, or from some, small place in Africa or Asia, that they can just, with that computational power and the software, be able to have those breakthroughs and to build those values. So it's a very interesting time, because it's very hard to predict how these models will develop. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit about your decision then to
Hmm.
do a SPAC and to go public, and to just now most likely with the intention to fuel the company with enough resources to grow faster.
Yeah. Well, we were very well capitalized after we raised our Series C at the beginning of this year.
I
And
saw that. I was so curious about that. Yeah.
yes, so we already were in good shape. We had $100 million plus in the balance sheet. We have a reasonably low burn rate relative, especially to the publicly traded companies, but call it, $30 million a year. So we had a good 3-year window to operate. And there were in many ways that seemed quite nice, where let's not worry about capital raising, and let's just execute, because we've got time to do it. What I saw happening, though, was the publicly traded companies start to take advantage of their position and raise very large amounts of capital, 500 million, $1 billion. And then you see some of the private companies raising very large amounts of capital as well. And we did fine in our private raise. and we achieved what we wanted to. But it was clear that the game was starting to change and might change much more. So I kind of made a commitment to myself at the beginning of this year that I needed to at least explore some ways to change the game for Inflection. And I looked at a number of different routes to do that. Just, fast following, raising another private round of capital was one of those options. We looked at going public via traditional IPO. The short answer was, though, those would all take quite a bit of time, probably. And I felt like the time was now. And so I went into this process with four principles. Number one, first principle across any of those was, could we find a world-class partner to work with? Because you just don't want to sacrifice on that principle. Number two, could we find a quantum of capital that would effectively take the existential risk of running out of capital off the table? And actually put a pause button on that one for a second, because there is an interesting point to make on that. And number three, could we have a very high probability that we would get that capital on the balance sheet? And then number four, could we do it at a cost of capital that was both fair to our existing investors, but also could make it a case where new investors had a great opportunity to earn a good return as well. And those were my four principles. And ultimately, meeting the team at the Churchill Group, I was able to easily accomplish all four of those principles. And so it became very obvious to me that that was the right path to go. Let's circle back on that second point I made, the existential risk. The other thing in the back of my mind was, that clearly people were raising a lot of capital. But as I thought just about Inflection, and I imagined 5 years down the line, and I imagined some scenarios that were scenarios where Inflection just didn't work. We failed. Not a lot of those scenarios involved not getting the tech right, which sounds kind of crazy because this is quantum, so you'd think that would have been at the top of the list. Almost all the scenarios were we ran out of capital, right? And let's say 2 years down the line, when it was time to go raise our Series D, the markets weren't accommodative and we couldn't get it done and we had to close up shop. And so I thought, if I could take that existential risk off the table, if we could raise an amount of capital that for almost all foreseeable scenarios would keep us capitalized, that was very attractive to me. And so that was really the reason why we went down this path. The added benefit of it, and you've seen the publicly traded quantum companies do this, especially IonQ, is now you have a public currency to make acquisitions. I am wary of acquisitions because a lot of them don't work. But tech tuck-in acquisitions can be very powerful if they accelerate your direct roadmap. And I do think there may be some private quantum companies that maybe are at risk of falling to that existential threat I just made, and there might be a home for them at Inflection, and that's a lot easier to do if you have a public currency, because it just is easier to make those acquisitions. And so that wasn't the primary driver, but I have a hunch that over the next 3 years it's going to be a very important thing to have, and will give us flexibility to possibly make some of those types of acquisitions where it's a 1 + 1 = 10 situation. It's great for the people that join the business via that acquisition, and it's great for Inflection because it accelerates our roadmap.
Wow, that's really strong. I think there's so much to learn from that and to take out of that analytical path and thinking about those scenarios. And it's something that I've written a lot about, how to anticipate the future and to create the now out of future scenarios. And not many leaders are good at that. So there is the path of exponential progress of technology, which everyone says we think it'll be progress, but they don't really sit down and think about what that means. And the other, what do we think of humanity? What do you think human beings will do? What kind of business models and structure can you foresee? So thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really powerful. So what are then the next steps now in terms of Inflection? What are the roadmap, the detailed roadmap for scaling? And also, what are the challenges of scaling an organization? I think one thing is obviously getting good engineers and physicists. I mean, that's war for talent, isn't it?
Yeah. It's We're not quite there yet, in the AI world where you're seeing $100 million pay packages put in
Right.
front of put in front of
That's
the
that's
AI
the best.
chiefs.
Then you know you've done something wrong. You're missing out on something. When you go desperate and you have too much cash on a dead business model potentially,
Yeah,
then you have to do that. So I think that's that's screaming we messed up. But yeah,
totally, totally. Yes. So what's next for us? So I'll answer it in two ways. Um, we have to commercialize and grow the quantum sensing business. And what that means is we have quantum clocks that are about, call it the size of a Xbox, a little bit bigger, and those have incredible performance capabilities. And we've flown them on airplanes, we've put them on ships, they've actually gone underwater, and they have gone into data centers and show real commercial advantage relative to classical standards. We need to build the go-to-market team that can get those out into the world. And in addition, we need to take that, call it, it's a 3U rack mount, so a little bit bigger than an Xbox, and shrink that down to a 1U rack mount, which is the size of a pizza box, call it, and ultimately down to chip scale. And that's one of the magic, that's one of the things that are magical about neutral atoms is it's mostly all based on photonics. So you can integrate all of that down to photonic level integrated circuits. So that's the end state for most of our technologies. So on the sensing side of the business, we need to continue to drive down the size, weight, power, and cost of the underlying components and therefore the systems themselves, and then get those out to market and actually fulfill the demand that's out there, with that GPS denial being one of the really strong tailwinds. And then same for our quantum RF antennas. They can do nearly magical things. We haven't talked about them yet, but there are huge commercial opportunities both within the DoD and the intelligence community, and also just the broader market for that type of product. And then finally, our inertial sensors are, I'd say, more in the realm of research still today. We have sent them to space. We sent them up to the International Space Station to be gravimeters, actually, back in 2018. And we're working to send more of those up into space with NASA. And so really, I'd say a lot of not R&D in the sense you'd think of with the computer, but R&D in the sense of commercializing and getting these into form factors that are more useful, and then driving the go-to-market on the sensing side of the business.
so
On the
what would
computing
be
side of the business,
sorry, yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was
No,
gonna say, on the
just
computing side of the business, it's continuing to push that logical qubit roadmap, right? We need to get it. We're at 12 today. We need to get to 100. Right now, we have two test beds, one effectively for quantity of qubits and one for quality of qubits. And we've got 1,600 physical qubits on the quantity system, and then we've got very high quality, 99.73% gate fidelity on the quantity system, and then or the quality system. We put those two together, and that's how we create our logical qubits. And so we now have 12, and really a very believable engineering roadmap to get us to 100 and then to 1,000. And so on the computing side of it, it's drive to that as quickly as possible. And so continue to drive up the quantities, continue to drive up the quality, and then bring those together for logical qubits. And then also there's as we talked about, a reasonable market to sell quantum computing systems. So we're going to continue to do that. And so it's all driving towards, this needs to ultimately be a very cash flow positive entity that is servicing real customer demand with products that provide huge advantages relative to classical standards. And that's what we think about every day, is how do we build this business to be that. And it's not going to be tomorrow that we're going to be profitable, nor would it be necessarily the smart thing to do, because the profit pools in the future are so massive. You want to invest behind them today, but ultimately, a company's only the company's value is just the discounted future free cash flows, right? So if there are never any free cash flows, there's zero value. And so we just need, obviously that's the long term goal for the business.
Right. So what is your internal timeline for the 100 and 1,000 logical qubits then?
2028 for the 100,
Right.
and then 2030 for the 1,000, which is what the current roadmap is.
Right. And to the antennas, I was curious about that. What are the use cases here? I was just I was thinking as you were speaking, because you haven't talked a lot about it. You said what are the business use cases that you see there?
Yes. Well, maybe let me just define what these Rydberg antennas are first.
Right.
So at the core of everything you do with neutral atom technology is you have some sort of cell. It might be an ultra high vacuum cell, it might be a vapor cell, and then you have lasers, and inside those cells are a bunch of atoms. And then with the lasers, you're working with those atoms to turn them into products. And I don't need to tell this audience what we mean when we say quantum, but we're just talking about the world of the very small, the atomic and the subatomic, and then the very strange quantum mechanics that take place at that level, which we don't need to talk about. But when you say quantum technologies, you're taking advantage of those weird quantum mechanics and then turning them into products. So we can turn those rubidium atoms into clocks by effectively exciting them with an ultra high frequency laser, and then the energy transition becomes a very stable frequency reference that ticks very, very precisely. Those same rubidium atoms, if put into what's called their Rydberg state, which is the most excited they can be before they become an ion, right? So that you can think of the electron way out in orbit. Those atoms in their Rydberg state become very sensitive to the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And so therefore you can turn those atoms into antennas, which is actually mind-boggling when you think about it, because it turns on its head everything we know about RF technology from the last 120 years, right? Which is normally the RF waves are received by some kind of metallic aperture, which is an antenna which resonates based upon that frequency, and then you can extract the electric signal inside that wave that way. In this case, you don't need that antenna. The atoms are the antenna. And when you're using classical RF technology, your antenna needs to be about the same size as the wavelength that you're receiving, right? And it can only receive a very narrow slug of the electromagnetic spectrum. So you have probably 10 antennas in your iPhone because you're receiving GNSS, you're receiving standard cellular signals, right? You're receiving Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc. Each of those has its own antenna. You could collapse all those down to one, something the size of a sugar cube, because we can dynamically tune it based upon the lasers to each of those frequency bands. So that's one of the magic parts of this. It's in a form factor today where it's not going to be in your phone for a while. The aperture itself is about the size of a sugar cube, but it's hooked up to a photonics system that today is the size of a mini fridge. Here's the killer app today, though. For the very low frequency, long wavelength signals that are used for a lot of different military communications channels, you need huge antennas. Like, I don't know, you might have dragged an antenna up to your roof one time that's massive, right? Or at the extreme, submarines dangle antennas that are a kilometer long.
Right.
Our Rydberg atoms can receive those signals. So you can vastly shrink the size of these antenna systems. And there are all kinds of interesting use cases there. Think of the intelligence community. If they need to put up a huge antenna to receive something, they're a target now. If you can do it with something the size of the sugar cube, you're not. And importantly, these emit no signals themselves, so completely undetectable. And every time you normally would receive a signal, you are putting out a signal yourself and therefore become a target. So a lot of really interesting intelligence community and defense community use cases, but ultimately you could see these being on every cell tower. You could see these, you look at a battleship, it looks like a porcupine because there's so many different antennas. Those could all be collapsed onto one. So huge use cases for this Rydberg technology.
Well, that is new to me. I haven't seen a lot of those cases and demonstration. That's very fascinating. Thank you so much for that. That's very interesting. That's but then you can also think then and again, thank you so much for I mean, this has been really interesting to me because I was hoping to get that economical aspect of it, and you've dug into the bridge between the technology and the economy, and that's very fascinating. So it was all I was hoping for to pick your brain on, Matt. So that's been a real joy for me to listen to you.
Oh, it's been a wonderful conversation, Anders. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. It went by really fast, actually. I can't believe it's already been close to an hour.
That's an hour. No, that's. But I want to just like kind of sort of I do this because I've written about the simulation hypothesis. My recent book with my quantum physicist colleague, we call it sci-fi science philosophy with the PHI, because we push the borders. And one of the things that I look into is that I think that the externalization of an artificial general intelligence, some kind of singularity put into a machine, is not a very positive path potentially for humanity. And what we argue is that we take the mensch, the human being, the essence of consciousness, the qualia, what it feels like, what we do not yet understand, and to be too romanticize of the concept of the mensch, hopefully never will get. So we start with that, and we hack chemistry, we hack biology, we build biological substrates, and we create what we call artificial human intelligence. And
Yeah.
look at the antenna. Why should it wander into the phone and not in here, right? So what do you think? Are there limits then to quantum technologies and quantum AI and technology? Is there, in your vision for a positive future for humanity, are there things that we cannot explain that are outside of quantum physics that are related to some other dimension? What it means to be a human being, or do you see us all chemical scum plus some math and some quantum physics?
Wow, I love this question, and so I'll say a few things before I answer, just so you know where I'm coming from. So I grew up a Catholic, so I'm Christian, and so believe in a higher power of some sort. I've also spent a lot of time reading Stoicism, and so the idea of the logos, or the underlying logic of the world, makes a lot of sense to me. And there's a ton of a lot of ways in which Stoicism and Catholicism are quite similar, and so I love, and I honestly have been so in the just race of building Inflection, I haven't had a chance to really sit back and ponder some of these things. But I think the tie-ins between quantum and religion and philosophy are fascinating. Even just at the most basic level of religion has always sort of seemed to occupy that space between human understanding and what we don't understand. So, when thunder would go off, that must have been something that the gods did, right? But once we understood what that was, it shrank that space. But quantum still very much occupies that space, right? It doesn't really make intuitive sense to us. And so I think there is a chance that maybe that is the layer where you can start to think of the higher power residing in some way, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe we'll figure it out, and then religion will occupy a different space. But I do think it's a really interesting topic to explore, and I'll see these posts on and I'll never really dig into them, but like that quantum is the only way to give AI actual a spirit, or make it conscious, right? It's going to give it consciousness. And so I wish and maybe someday I'll sit back and would love to talk to you more about this kind of stuff offline, because I found it fascinating. But I do think there is something there at the very most basic level, and it's fascinating to let your mind go to those places to think about.
Now,
Yeah.
this is, because I don't need a solid ground under my feet. I've gone down all this rabbit hole, and I consider myself an agnostic atheist. So
Yeah.
and then I have a huge respect for having something to believe it, because it gives you some kind of structure and substance to hold on to. I don't need that. So any psychedelic experience where reality dissolves, I say, well, this is normal. This is just, if you have a computer, you have a simulation, you don't have to render everything into perfect pixels. You can just have, it can dissolve. And so to me, I don't need that structures. I can dance between the explicable and the
Yeah.
dimension of whatever you want to call it. So it's very fast. I'm very privileged to learn from all these very smart people and to listen to them, how they are kind of sort of held hostage in their own domain, while
Yeah.
the same.
Totally.
So my co-author just published a very interesting paper on the quantum memory matrix, where he
Okay.
argues that any information in the universe is stored in a quantum memory matrix. So basically, meaning is information, and it just then could collapse into some kind of big crunch, a singularity where in a black hole information is stored. And that has been peer reviewed, published. And the first thing that he got then was, well, this is Akashic records. So you just see that the whole dimension of spirituality and some kind of holistic universe, there are so many ways to go about. And I 100% agree with you. We have gone through history where we have thin sliced what we claim to be godly, and put a label, a math a formula on it. And I think
Yeah.
that's where we're heading. We are moving towards the unification of mythology, folklore, and enlightenment, basically
Yep.
where science and philosophy could meet. So I think a lot about. I have the privilege of not being responsible for a bunch of people in my organization, so I could sit down and think about this. But but I resonate very much with your drive because it has become to me also now a passion to actually build it. So I have this vision to quote unquote build a human being by applying this, and I literally hope I fail because it takes away the magic. But it
Yeah,
just
yeah,
it,
totally.
all the dimension that you mentioned, we talked about that on that path to understanding what qualia, consciousness, life at a cellular level is. There is so much business, and I think that, and that's what I liked about your values and philosophy that capitalism, more power to it if it serves for the benefit of humanity, and we can use technology for progress. So this was also something that I wanted to just get a feeling because I read a little bit about your drive towards improving the state of humanity, and I think that's very very important in today's world to have leaders that unite those values. So yeah, thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Anders, and I totally agree. Yeah, I agree. It's really important.
Yeah. So you think the brain is a quantum computer, or is it something magical? Then there is some godliness to it, or
Boy,
yeah,
I don't. Yeah,
dare to make.
I still, until maybe scientifically proven wrong, I still think, that God plays an element in there. But, that could be he just, designed the quantum computer or something, right? So I don't know. It is. I I default to my my religious beliefs, but I don't honestly I haven't thought deeply enough about those even in so long, especially after having gone down the quantum rabbit hole. And I do need to go sit in a dark room and just think and get my head straight on all these things. Yeah.
Yeah, but what a beautiful way to end the hour, Matt, to take us back from a capitalistic driven investor that has a deep passion for deep technologies, going into the role of the CEO, driving towards going public, and then taking it back to religion. I think
Love
that
it.
was
We've covered it all. We've covered it all, Anders. Yeah.
again, Matt. Thank you so much for doing this with me, spending
Yeah.
so much time.
This was a blast. Yeah.
And
Great conversation.
congrats on your all the things that you're doing. I'm going to follow Inflection and hope to have a chat with you on or offline at a later point or in near future.
I'd love that. I'd love it. Yep. Well, thank you for this, and thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah.